Welcome to International Agenda, a show about India's global positioning, co-created by Gateway House, Indian Council on Global Relations, and the Indian Express. My name is Bipratap Vikram Singh, and let me start today by introducing our panel. We have Ambassador Neelam Deo, Director at Gateway House, Manjeet Kripalani, Executive Director at Gateway House, and Shaji Vikraman, Senior Editor at the Indian Express. Thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the discussion will revolve around, is Trump good for India?
I think Prime Minister Modi and President Trump will get on famously. They are both extroverted personalities and they are both unconventional personalities. I think that it would have been extraordinary if he had not brought a non-international relations specialist to the job of Secretary of State, because the most important element of his campaign and of his personality would seem to be to break up the establishment, to change things, act as a change agent by design or inadvertently. Mr. Tillerson has spent his entire life in Exxon and clearly a very successful person to have become the CEO 10 years ago. Anyone who deals with energy will take India seriously. We are the third or fourth largest consumer of fossil fuels, and we have already become a big part of the renewable energy movement and have an even bigger part to play in this. So even though Exxon has not been in India for the last 2 decades, I think there is no question that he will begin to take an interest in India just from his past career, but also in terms of his future career. And there may be some tough things that go here. Under President Obama, who in his first term paid no attention to India, and in his second term paid quite a lot of attention. He is the first president to have come to India twice, to have been a guest at the January 26th parade. But it was really Ashton Carter, the Secretary of Defense, who introduced all the substance in the Indo-US relationship. Now I think the State Department will want to have a piece of the relationship with India, and I think it would be a very good tension for India if both the Defense Department and the State Department were vying to pick up the relationship with India.
Manjeet, now when it comes to the Defense Secretary, as Neelam mentioned, Ash Carter really shaped the bilateral, but even Trump's pick, General James Mattis, during his cabinet hearing day before yesterday, he also brought in a very interesting perspective when it comes to Pakistan. Is this really playing right into India's hand? And similarly, what can India do to build on the groundwork that General Mattis seems to be laying out?
But clearly this is our opportunity. We have, after a very long time, somebody in the US who is willing not to walk on eggshells around Pakistan and to think that it is a protected relationship. We hope very much that the engagement with Pakistan will become realistic now with the US, that they will understand indeed that terrorism emanates from Pakistan and that it is financed by the Saudis. If in fact the US has become, as we know, self-sufficient in energy, and Saudi oil is less and less important to it, as it will be now in the very near future, then it's time to break all the shibboleths. It's time to destroy it. We can, I think, hope for the US to be tough on Pakistan. We can hope for a better global engagement, because we really have been blocked off from our borders because of Pakistan and because of all this mischief making around our borders in the north and the east. We will have to tackle China, because Pakistan understands this. It now has a new protector, and that is China, which is also in a rivalry with India. So we're going to have to wait and watch and make sure that that the US also understands these engagements with us, and maybe Neelam will want to add to it a little bit.
Yeah, Neelam, actually coming back to the fact that General Mattis will be the first general to lead the Department of Defense after more than 60 years. We've seen a build up in the South China Sea with regards to the US and China relation. What does this mean for India's concern with the South China Sea and its geostrategic concerns in that region?
I think it's quite important in the sense that General Mattis may not have an identical perspective on the South China Sea and on China itself as President Trump will. But following in that same direction, it will become more and more important, and the joint vision statement that we had signed with the United States only looked at the Arabian Sea to the west of India and dealt with those issues excluding Pakistan, which was therefore not very significant for us. This issue must also deal with the eastern side, and the kind of position that the Americans take with China will also help in determining what the other countries in the region do. What is Japan's position? How hard can it be? What will be the Australian contribution to this geostrategic perspective? What will Vietnam, which has usually won its wars against China, do in this circumstance? What about Singapore? Even though we already know that countries like Philippines, Malaysia, small countries like Cambodia and Laos have tried to make peace with China, which is the rising hegemon in the region. But it is important for us that the relationship with the United States look at both aspects, because the passages, the shipping passages through the South China Sea are just as important as the shipping passages on the western side of India, and we want an equation and a perspective that encompasses the whole of that region, all the way from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Ocean.
Shaji, I want to bring you in on the economic perspective as well. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump's positioning towards China, his choice for Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross is also positioned as a person who is going to be very tough on trade. What does this mean for the US-China relation, and how India, and how does India fit into that?
I think he's been talking of labeling China as a currency manipulator, and already there have been warnings. In fact, actually, I think even the Chinese officials have reacted, saying that any attempt at that, including imposing tariffs, actually there will be retaliation. So I think they will also have to be after. I personally think the rhetoric after the election rhetoric, after that, when reality sets in, it will be different. And I would also like to believe that the fact that China as a holder of US treasuries, actually, I think the US will also have to be mindful of these facts. A little over 1.2 trillion of US treasuries which China holds as its reserves, along with the Japanese. Some of these things will also be which the US administration will certainly have to be mindful of, and the fact that China's contribution, actually, in terms of rebalancing, in terms of growth, which will have an impact not just on the US, on many other economies, in fact, actually. In fact, there could be ripple effects, in fact, on many other, including it could be for India, in fact, when you look at that relationship, which is testy. But I personally think that, rhetoric apart, I think apart from that rhetoric, whether he will go ahead and do all that, I think I'm not certain at all whether they'll do it once they come into office.
Because the US and China are in a deadly embrace with each other.
Absolutely. Right? Except that probably Neelam probably would be in a better position to say that whether this in the new dispensation, whether India will be forced to shed its ambiguity on its stand on many things, including on China, is something which will be tested, I suppose, actually.
Neelam, anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to,
because the US may force the issue.
There is no question that the Obama administration sort of took its eye off China, because it got so focused on hostility to Russia over the Ukraine and the Crimea situation. I think that we will certainly see everything taxed to the center once you are in power and in position, and there is a climb down from campaign rhetoric. But I think there will be more pressure on the fact that China makes it very hard for foreign companies to come in. It makes all kinds of demands on technology sharing. It does not allow foreign investment, even in things like chains of petrol stations, leave alone aviation, leave alone a whole slew of industries that people criticize India for.
Yeah.
So I think you will actually see a harder position than previous administrations on China. And as to the treasury bonds that China holds, yes, it's important for the United States, but it's equally important for China that their value not decline by a too hasty sell off, or to disturb that market. So it's a dependency relationship, yes, but in the past the Chinese have been able to get away with a lot. We will see now whether Trump follows that trend, or he and his Commerce Secretary take a position which requires the Chinese also to be more forthcoming. And we've seen that in some other cases. When he said he's going to junk NAFTA, the Canadians jumped to say that we will renegotiate NAFTA. So people are already adjusting themselves to the positions that Trump has taken even before he became president, and this is especially true of American companies. So Ford, Fiat Chrysler, Carrier have already said they are going to create more jobs in the United States. There is lots of American investment in China as well.
Right, but when it comes to Indian priorities on that front, what does India think about the impact that Trump is sort of going to have on services and on immigration? Immigration has been always a major concern for the India-US bilateral. So Manjeet, to bring you into this discussion, how will Trump follow through on his immigration policies, and if he does, how does that going to impact Indian services?
Veer, it may not be such a bad thing for Trump to follow up on his immigration policies. Part of these are his campaign promises, and as we know from all the nationalist leaders, they stick to their campaign promises. Mr. Modi has stuck to his with demonetization and anti-corruption. Xi Jinping, they don't have elections, but he has stuck to his anti-corruption promise. They all do it. So we can expect that to happen, and it may not be such a bad thing for India. India's IT industry is totally dependent on foreign income.
Yeah.
They only work for foreign companies. They have not at all invested at home. And so we have been lagging behind the IT curve, although Bangalore behaves as if it's a part of Silicon Valley. It's a precinct in that area, and they are more focused on the US election than they are on the local Karnataka or even Bangalore elections. This has to change. The Indian IT sector has not invested in innovation at home, and if there are fewer H1B visas, it's fine. Our guys have gotten absolutely stuck on what we call the 25 by 25 issue, which is $25 an hour for 25% return a year. That will come to an end, and all the Reddys and all the Hyderabadis, which are the Andhras are the biggest community of IT experts in the US, they will now come back home and innovate, and they should. So I think it may not be such a bad thing for the Mexicans, etc. Really, it is a time, the immigration now should be focused on a refugee immigration, which is all the wars that the US has created around the world, and where they have to now think about what is going to happen to the refugee population. Economic migration, we don't know.
What I'd like to add to that is, of course, that it's not the US alone, it's also Europe,
yes,
which has added to the wars and the refugee outflow. But it is also the trend, and you will have noticed that in Theresa May's address yesterday. What they all want, and the US will also want, and they have said so, is high value individuals to be allowed to come in and work in the United States, in the UK. They do not want the kind of techie contribution that many of our companies with operations in the US were providing. So this too is a global trend.
So I think we are already seeing, actually if I could quickly add to it, it's a 160 billion industry we have in India, and we already have seen reports coming out that some of these big Indian companies are going to hire from the US, in fact, actually, yes, after all this. Those reports have come, and the fact that actually, as Manjeet said, this had to end at some point of time. Our dependence on services, and our dependence on the service industry, and the fact that now they have to settle for lower margins, this had to happen at some point of time, and also to look inwards. So this was inevitable, I think, at some point of time. So it isn't as bad as I think it's probably being made
So
out to be.
what does this mean for Indian growth? We've seen a period where India has managed to reach exceptionally high figures of growth. With these policies on immigration, with various tax regimes, which I'm going to address to Manjeet about, how is this going to divert the investment that we were hoping to come into India? Is it diverting it to the US, and what does that mean for us?
So, I mean, if he's going to have a stimulus, tax cuts, if all those are going to happen, typically investment will probably be channelized more towards the US than as an attractive investment destination than probably here. But at the end of it, actually, US, if you look at the IT industry and you look at pharma industry, for instance, and maybe auto components to a certain extent, if that industry may probably, if at all, get impacted if there's he comes with tariffs actually and imposes tax. Apart from that, actually, I think from a real economy point of view, I don't think India to that extent will be impacted. Certainly, if you look at it, except for the fact that if Europe plus China plus all that which happens, some of the ripple effects of what happens in the economy could have an impact on India, because of, to that extent, our exports may be hit in those countries and investment in those countries. But otherwise, I think there is an opportunity to be had by looking within India, in fact, actually, which is what, if you remember, Raghuram Rajan said famously, which anyway led to a controversy when he said that when the government said make in India, he said make for India, because he said that he said in 2015 that all this volatility, what uncertain world, it will continue, endure for quite some time.
And
right.
You consider that India imports from China $1 billion worth of smartphones alone. Surely we should manufacture for India. If those are the considerations.
And we have just realized recently.
One other thing, which is that a number of Indian companies, auto parts and IT, have invested in Mexico, and Trump's real complaints about immigration are from South America, from Mexico. So there will be some impact on the profits of those companies which are invested in Mexico.
Because of NAFTA.
Because of either
they had initially invested,
NAFTA or the renegotiation of NAFTA, there may be some impact there.
Right. Manjeet, I want to bring you in on the tax reforms that Trump has laid out, which really seem to be easing the hurdles for doing business there. Can you share some light into the tax reforms and the idea of a flat tax?
Yes, absolutely. 20 years ago, Steve Forbes, who was a Republican candidate, had introduced the idea of a flat tax. It was a 70% flat tax, and the reason he said is because the US tax code was 25,000 pages long and it was 24,999 pages too long. It created corruption, as we know taxes everywhere do, because everyone is looking for a loophole, and it created it made Washington just a lobbyist city. 20 years later, this is all coming to pass. Trump needs to stimulate his economy. The best way to do it is to have a flat tax at home so that corporations can come back home and invest. In tax havens, he's asked again people and corporations to bring their money back home, taxed at a minimal 10%, which is not bad for capital gains. And when you hear about that, you can also hear the great whooshing sound leaving the emerging markets and going back to the US, because we've had a great old time with easy money, and now is the time for us to really start working hard on our own economies. We are already hearing noises in India. Arun Jaitley said he's going to have a 25% corporate tax, and last week in the Indian Express, Sujit Bhalla had written about a 12% flat tax. Absolutely every country is going to be forced to follow suit. This because otherwise the US will have a huge unfair advantage. All our businesses will go there instead of being here. So we're going to have to follow suit. This is going to be revolutionary in the world. To look at taxes being minimum, and how can companies rise to this challenge instead of just doing things looking through the lens of a tax loophole. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, but I think it's going to be hugely challenging for India, I agree, because the same rhetoric you can hear in India of a lower tax cuts and the demand for tax cuts and to stimulate again at a very difficult time. US is enjoying a record since 2008, wages have risen. I think and you see the way bond yields are moving, and the way that the outlook for the economy. But look at India, it's completely different. So the challenges of cutting corporate tax, unlike the US, I'm sure there's going to be pressure in India, but look at the reality in India. The tax to GDP ratio for an economy like India is probably one of the lowest, a little over 10. And if you look at what even the Prime Minister was forced to say at the end of the year in his address to the nation, that the 24 lakh people only in this country, economy, a 2 trillion economy, a country has just 24 lakh people reporting incomes and paying tax of over 10 lakhs. So how do you reduce tax? I mean, and even attempt to do all this? And if you look at the corporate tax, as you mentioned, 25% corporate tax, but the effective tax actually is much lower. So I don't know whether there's a case even for cutting it in India, because the effective rate, if you take into account exemptions in India, which is not the case in other countries, is far lower.
No, I would say that on that our finance minister actually has been ahead. He has talked about reducing the rate, but also cutting out exemptions.
Right.
And the way to expand your tax net in India is by simplifying the procedures.
One page.
You know, as they used to say in America, not just one page, they used to say it must fit on a postcard.
Yes.
You should be able to send a postcard to the IRS.
Yeah.
So, the need is to simplify. That is the only way to widen the tax net, and to lower it, to make it more beneficial to pay the tax than to make all these illegal ways to not pay it. And I do think that that will have an impact, because one of the reasons that we have these difficulties is because many of our companies borrowed in dollars. The rupee has devalued against the dollar. That is impacting bank non-performing assets, all those things. We have to take it, and if whatever the outcome and the final assessment of demonetization is, one of the things that this Prime Minister has shown, that he is willing to take hard decisions, and if they go into GST, of course there will be disruptions and it may affect the rate of growth, but eventually there are these 3-4 things which have to be done.
So we've now managed to come to the end of our show, and before we wind up, I want to get one point from each of you as to what India should do in order to better improve its bilateral with the United States with the new president coming in. So,
Neelam, go first.
Neelam, if we can start with you.
I think that, as they say, that a 9% rate of growth is the best way to improve your relationship with any country in the world. I think the more that you focus on improving things domestically, the better it is, and especially for developing countries. And here we should take a lesson from China maybe. China focused for 25 years, starting with Deng Xiaoping, on its own economy. It did not pick fights with anybody. It did not challenge the United States of America as the hegemon in the Pacific area. And once the economy became attractive enough, then you can take on everything else.
Manjeet?
I think our relationship with the US has never been better. We are now trying to make up for lost time, 60 years of not having an engagement with the US. But I would recommend to our readers that they read our recently published book, in which we have a very, very bullish view of the US, that the India-US partnership can reach 1 trillion by 2030, so through various means, including participating with the US in new technologies to bring down for issues of climate change, to work with them on innovations. We already have that good link with Silicon Valley and Bangalore, and on issues of education, and also to bring in the non-resident Indian into the Indian environment in a way that they can help more, rather than just through remittances and NRI bonds.
I think the engagement, as you said, will be deeper, but I personally think that this is a great opportunity to relook at what we should be doing inward, to look at what the Indian economy, I think, because if you look at not just at the US, you look at economies across the bigger economies, I think everybody is looking inward, and I think we should probably, this is a great opportunity for us to get our act in place. Particularly, we are going to have a very important year with the GST coming into place, plus the opportunities in India. I think ultimately, I think if we get all that right, everything, and I think it's again a wonderful time to review our Indian outsourcing services industry. I think it's run its course over, and it's helped in many ways actually at a critical time, but I think wonderful time to look at not only, as you said earlier, innovation and the kind of things which Indian industry should be looking at in its own market, the process what we should completely look at it and concentrate that over the next 2 years. And as you said, when that happens along with some of the important changes in taxation, critical changes in taxation, that will reflect on growth, and as we all know, when that happens, automatically countries gravitate towards it, and which anyway is reflected in diplomatic engagements at the end of the day.
Well, thank you all three of you for joining us, and thank you for joining us on the international agenda. This show was about India's global position, and it was co-created by Gateway House and Indian Express. Thank you.
Thank you.